These people don't belong here. This is private property. I told you they were criminals. I knew it. Lock them all up." Saying this was a white woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, wearing expensive clothes. She was pointing her manicured finger at this family and screaming at the top of her lungs. "I need police immediately," Brielle said, her voice filled with fake urgency and manufactured concern. "There's a suspicious black family with a child on our private beach." Her voice was shrill, filled with vindication, as if she had just solved the crime of the century. She was practically bouncing on her designer sneakers, so excited that she was right about these people who had dared to set foot on what she considered her territory. Soon, the sounds of threatening alarms from the police vehicles appeared, ready to arrest a black family who were casually on the beach. The police officers were treating this like they had just arrested public enemy number one. They were rough, they were aggressive, and they were completely convinced they had done the right thing. The lead officer, a man who looked like he had seen too many episodes of cop shows, was barking orders and acting like he had just saved the entire neighborhood from some terrible threat. Then the story took a turn that nobody saw coming. In the distance, 3 black SUVs with tinted windows were approaching fast, and they weren't slowing down. They were federal government vehicles, the kind that showed up when something big was about to go down. The SUVs screeched to a halt, and car doors started slamming one after another. Men and women in crisp black suits emerged, moving with the kind of purpose and authority that made everyone stop and pay attention. They wore sunglasses, they had badges hanging from their necks, and they looked like they meant serious business. The local police officers suddenly looked confused, maybe even a little nervous. But here was the moment that changed everything. The man in handcuffs, the one who had been treated like a criminal this entire time, slowly turned to look at the officers who had arrested him. His voice was calm, steady, and carried an authority that cut through all the chaos like a knife through butter. He looked directly at the lead officer and said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your lives." The silence that followed was deafening. You could practically hear the sound of careers ending and lawsuits being filed. The white woman who had been so confident, so sure that she had caught criminals, suddenly looked like she had seen a ghost. The police officers' faces went from confident to confused to absolutely terrified in about 3 seconds flat. Before we dive into how this incredible situation unfolded, if you stand against injustice and prejudice, hit that subscribe button right now. Type justice and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. You will definitely get a heartwarming reply from us, because this story is going to take you on an emotional roller coaster that you would never forget. Now, you might have been wondering how a simple family vacation could possibly have led to such an explosive confrontation. How did a day that started with a father, mother, and daughter just trying to enjoy some time at the beach end up with federal agents, arrests, and a revelation that shocked everyone involved? What started as discrimination and hatred ended with arrests, federal investigations, and consequences that reached far beyond that beach. The people who thought they were in control discovered they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. And the family who was victimized got justice in a way that nobody could have predicted. But to understand how we got to this incredible moment, we needed to go back to the beginning. To a family who just wanted to spend some quality time together, and to the woman whose prejudice and assumptions set off a chain of events that would change multiple lives forever. First, there was Darius Blackwell, a 45-year-old man who had achieved something extraordinary. He wasn't just any FBI agent. He was the FBI chief of the Counterterrorism Division, one of the most powerful and respected positions in federal law enforcement. But Darius hadn't been handed this position on a silver platter. This was a man who had clawed his way up from the poorest neighborhoods of Detroit, where he grew up surrounded by violence, drugs, and despair. For 20 long years, Darius had dedicated his life to climbing the ranks of the FBI. He had worked nights, weekends, and holidays. He had missed birthdays, anniversaries, and family gatherings. He had sacrificed personal relationships and his own well-being to prove that he belonged in a world where people who looked like him were often viewed with suspicion rather than respect. Every case he solved, every criminal he helped put behind bars, every terrorist plot he helped uncover, it all led to this moment where he had finally reached the top. He was the FBI chief, responsible for protecting the entire nation from terrorist threats, and he commanded the respect of agents across the country. But all of that success came with a price. Darius hadn't taken a real vacation in 3 years. 3 entire years of non-stop work, of carrying the weight of national security on his shoulders, of being available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. His phone never stopped ringing, his email never stopped pinging, and the stress never stopped building. Then there was his wife, Keisha Blackwell, 42 years old and the heart of their family. Keisha was a pediatric nurse who had dedicated her life to caring for sick children, and she brought that same nurturing spirit to her marriage and motherhood. She had been married to Darius for 18 beautiful, challenging, complicated years. Keisha understood the weight her husband carried. She knew that his job wasn't just a career. It was a calling, a responsibility that could mean the difference between life and death for countless Americans. She had learned to live with the late-night phone calls, the sudden departures for emergency situations, and the constant worry that came with loving someone who put his life on the line for others. And then there was their pride and joy, 8-year-old Amara Blackwell, who was absolutely brilliant beyond her years. This little girl had inherited her father's determination and her mother's compassion, but she had also developed her own incredible passion for science that amazed everyone who met her. But more than anything else, Amara was Daddy's girl. She worshipped her father, was fascinated by his work, and dreamed of growing up to fight bad guys just like him. She didn't fully understand what her daddy did for work, but she knew he was important. She knew he helped people, and she knew he was her hero. For Amara, this upcoming vacation wasn't just a trip to the beach. It was going to be her very first time seeing the ocean. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, researching marine biology, planning water sample collections, and dreaming about all the incredible creatures she might discover in the tide pools. Now, on the other side of this story, there was a completely different person, whose life was about to intersect with this loving family in the most destructive way possible. Her name is Brielle Ashworth, and she is a 38-year-old woman whose life had recently fallen apart in spectacular fashion. Brielle was a real estate agent who had once been successful, who had once lived a comfortable middle-class life, and who had once believed that she had everything figured out. But then her world came crashing down. Her husband left her for a younger woman, taking half of everything they had built together. Her real estate career, which had once seemed so promising, began to struggle as the market changed and competition increased. The vacation rental properties she owned, which were supposed to be her path to financial security, were losing money as maintenance costs rose and bookings declined. Brielle found herself facing a reality she had never imagined. She was struggling financially, she was alone, and she was bitter about how unfair life had become. But instead of taking responsibility for her situation or working to improve it, Brielle had found someone else to blame for her problems. In her mind, the issue wasn't her failed marriage or her business struggles. It was all these outsiders who were moving into her neighborhood, changing the character of the community, and somehow threatening everything she held dear. She had appointed herself as the unofficial neighborhood protector, constantly watching for anyone who didn't look like they belonged in what she considered her exclusive territory. So when this family of 3 arrived at Seaside Heights for what they hoped would be a peaceful, relaxing vacation, none of them had any idea that their paths were about to cross with someone whose prejudice and bitterness would turn their dream trip into a nightmare. The Blackwell family, pulled up to their vacation rental on a beautiful sunny morning, and for the first time in years, Darius actually looked relaxed. His phone was tucked away, his work emails were being ignored, and he was focused entirely on his wife and daughter. This was such a rare sight that Keisha couldn't help but smile as she watched her husband genuinely unwind for the first time in months. They had booked this rental months in advance, had paid their money just like everyone else, and had every legal right to be there. The property included access to a private beach, which was one of the main reasons they had chosen this particular location. For a family that lived in the city, the idea of having a quiet, safe beach where Amara could explore to her heart's content was worth every penny they had paid. As they unloaded their car, you could see the excitement building. There were beach toys for Amara to play with, comfortable chairs for the adults to relax in, and of course, Amara's precious science equipment that she insisted on bringing everywhere. She had packed test tubes, pH strips, magnifying glasses, and collection containers because she was determined to study ocean water and see how it compared to the tap water back home. The moment they were unpacked, Amara was practically bouncing with excitement. She had never seen the ocean before, had never felt sand between her toes, and had never had the chance to explore tide pools filled with mysterious creatures. This was going to be the adventure of her young lifetime. So the family made their way toward the private beach access that was included with their rental. Amara skipped ahead, her science kit bouncing in her backpack, chattering excitedly about all the experiments she wanted to conduct. Behind her, Darius and Keisha walked hand in hand, enjoying one of those perfect family moments that seem to happen so rarely in their busy lives. Keisha looked at her husband and realized she hadn't seen him this peaceful in years. The stress lines around his eyes had softened, his shoulders were tense with worry, and for once, he wasn't constantly checking his phone for the next crisis that needed his attention. But their perfect family moment was about to be shattered by someone who had decided they didn't belong there. As they approached the beach, Amara ran ahead and immediately began examining the tide pools with the focused intensity of a real scientist. She pulled out her collection kit and started carefully gathering water samples, completely absorbed in her work and totally innocent of the storm that was brewing behind her. That's when Brielle Ashworth appeared. Brielle had been doing one of her regular property inspections, walking around the area to make sure everything was exactly as it should be. When she spotted this family accessing what she considered to be an exclusive beach area, in her mind, she knew exactly who belonged in this neighborhood and who didn't. And this family definitely didn't fit her expectations. Without bothering to think, without considering that they might have every right to be there, without even attempting to be polite or respectful, Brielle marched directly toward this family with the kind of aggressive energy that immediately put everyone on high alert. She looked directly at Darius and Keisha and said in the most condescending, hostile tone imaginable, "Excuse me, you people don't belong here. This is private property." And just like that, a perfect family vacation was about to become a federal incident that would make national news, end careers, and expose the ugly truth about what happened when assumptions based on race collided with reality in the most spectacular way possible. What happened next would test everything this family believed about justice, challenge everything they thought they knew about standing up for themselves, and ultimately reveal truths that would shock everyone involved, including Brielle herself, who had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Keisha felt her heart start racing the moment she heard Brielle's hostile tone. Every instinct in her body was telling her that this situation was about to get bad, really bad. But she also knew that as a Black woman, her response in this moment could determine whether her family made it home safely or became another tragic news story. With hands that were already beginning to shake, Keisha nervously stepped forward and reached into her beach bag to pull out their rental agreement. She had learned long ago that when confronted by suspicious white people, documentation was your first line of defense. Even though deep down she knew that papers didn't always matter when someone had already decided you didn't belong. "Ma'am," Keisha said, her voice as calm and respectful as she could manage. "We're staying at the rental property right over there. Here's our agreement showing we have full access to this beach area." But Brielle didn't even bother to look at the documents properly. She glanced at them for maybe 2 seconds before dismissing them with the kind of arrogance that came from years of never being questioned or challenged. "These look fake," Brielle declared, as if she was some kind of expert in rental documentation. "I know every family that can afford to stay in this neighborhood, and you people are definitely not one of them." The phrase, "you people," hung in the air like poison, and everyone within earshot knew exactly what she meant. This wasn't about rental agreements or beach access. This was about race, and Brielle had just made that crystal clear to everyone around. Darius, who had been watching this interaction with growing concern, stepped forward with the calm authority that came from 20 years of dealing with hostile situations. He reached into his wallet and pulled out additional identification, credit cards, and documentation that proved beyond any doubt that they were legitimate renters. "Ma'am, I understand your concern about security," Darius said, his voice steady and professional. "Here's my driver's license, our credit card receipt for the rental, and confirmation emails from the property management company. We're here on vacation, just like anyone else." But Brielle wasn't interested in facts or evidence. Her mind was already made up, and nothing they could show her was going to change her opinion about what she thought she was seeing. "Vacation?" She laughed. And it was the kind of bitter, mocking laugh that made everyone uncomfortable. "In this neighborhood? I don't think so. You're probably casing houses for break-ins later. That's what people like you do, isn't it?" Keisha's voice began to tremble as the situation continued to escalate, despite their attempts to be reasonable and compliant. Everything about this confrontation was triggering memories of other encounters where being polite and respectful hadn't been enough to protect her family from harassment and humiliation. "Ma'am, we just want to enjoy our family time," Keisha pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, we're not causing any trouble. We just want to give our daughter her first beach experience." But even as she spoke these words, Keisha could feel the terror building inside her chest. This was exactly the kind of situation she had nightmares about, being confronted by an angry white person who refused to listen to reason, with her young daughter watching everything unfold. For Darius, this moment represented an impossible choice that no parent should ever have to make. Every instinct he had developed over 20 years of law enforcement was telling him to de-escalate this situation and protect his family. But he was also facing an internal struggle that was tearing him apart. Part of him wanted to reveal his identity as FBI chief right then and there, to use his authority and position to shut down this harassment immediately. But another part of him needed to see how this would play out, to experience firsthand what happened when a regular black family was subjected to this kind of discrimination. Darius knew that if he flashed his badge, this situation would end instantly. Brielle would back down, the confrontation would stop, and his family would be left alone. But he also knew that millions of other black families didn't have FBI credentials to protect them, and he wanted to see exactly what they faced when confronted with this kind of prejudice. It was a decision that would haunt him later, but in that moment, he chose to let the situation continue, so he could witness the full extent of how the system treated people who looked like him. Meanwhile, little Amara was becoming increasingly confused and frightened by what was happening around her. This 8-year-old girl had been so excited about her first ocean experience, so focused on her scientific experiments, and so innocent about the realities of racial discrimination that she couldn't understand why this strange woman was being so mean to her family. As Brielle's voice got louder and more aggressive, Amara started to cry. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging on Keisha's shirt, Why is she being so mean to us? What did we do wrong? The sight of this innocent child in distress should have been enough to make any reasonable person step back and reconsider their actions. But Brielle was no longer operating from a place of reason. She was operating from a place of deep-seated bitterness and prejudice that had been building for months. You see, Brielle's hostility wasn't really about this family at all. It was about everything that had gone wrong in her life over the past year. When her husband left her, when her business started failing, when her financial situation became desperate, Brielle needed someone to blame for her problems. She had inherited these vacation rental properties from her parents, and they were supposed to be her ticket to financial security. But the reality was that maintaining these properties was expensive, the rental market was competitive, and Brielle wasn't nearly as good at business as she thought she was. Instead of taking responsibility for her failures or working to improve her situation, Brielle had decided that the problem was all these outsiders who were somehow ruining her neighborhood. In her twisted logic, if she could just keep the wrong kind of people away from her properties, everything would magically get better. But the truth was that Brielle's properties were failing because she was a terrible businesswoman, not because of some imaginary invasion of undesirable renters. As this confrontation continued, other beachgoers began to notice the commotion and started gathering around to see what was happening. Some of them looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but several others began nodding in agreement with Brielle's accusations. "Yeah, I've seen them around here before," one middle-aged man said, even though that was completely untrue. "They don't look like they belong in this area." "Somebody should call security," added a woman in expensive sunglasses. "We pay good money to keep this beach exclusive." The crowd's support emboldened Brielle even further, and she pulled out her phone to start taking pictures of the family as evidence of their supposed wrongdoing. This was when Darius realized that the situation had crossed a line from harassment into something potentially dangerous. He discreetly pulled out his own phone and sent a quick text message to his FBI team. "Need backup. Situation escalating. Bring credentials." The message was brief, but it would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose the truth in the most spectacular way possible. Keisha noticed her husband texting, and part of her wanted to ask who he was contacting. But she was too scared to speak, too focused on protecting her daughter, and too aware that anything she said might make this situation even worse. As Brielle continued taking photos and making accusations, Amara's crying became more intense. The little girl was clinging to her mother and asking over and over again, "Mommy, why is she being so mean to us?" Keisha pulled Amara closer, her own voice shaking as she tried to comfort her terrified daughter. "It's okay, baby. Stay close to Mommy. Everything's gonna be okay." But even as she spoke these words, Keisha wasn't sure she believed them herself. She could see the hatred in Brielle's eyes, could hear the support from the gathering crowd, and could feel the situation spiraling completely out of control. That's when Brielle made an accusation so outrageous, so completely divorced from reality, that it would change everything about what happened next. Looking at this loving family, a father trying to protect his wife and daughter, a mother desperately trying to comfort her frightened child, Brielle saw something completely different. "See," she shouted, pointing at Amara clinging to her mother. "Look how terrified that child is. They're probably trafficking her. This isn't a family vacation. This is a kidnapping operation." The accusation was so absurd, so completely insane, that it should have been dismissed immediately by anyone with half a brain. But in the current atmosphere of fear and suspicion, Brielle's words carried weight with people who were already predisposed to believe the worst about this black family. Before anyone could respond to this ridiculous accusation, Brielle was already dialing 911 on her phone, and the call she was about to make would turn this harassment into a federal incident that would make national news. 911, what's your emergency? came the voice from the other end of the line. "I need police immediately," Brielle said, her voice filled with fake urgency and manufactured concern. "There's a suspicious black family with a child on our private beach. I think this might be a human trafficking operation. The man has suspicious equipment, and the woman looks absolutely terrified. The child appears to be in distress. You need to send multiple units immediately. This could be really serious." Every word of that 911 call was a lie, but it was exactly the kind of lie that would bring armed police officers to confront an innocent family on what should have been a peaceful vacation day. As Brielle finished her call, Keisha felt her world starting to collapse around her. She leaned close to her husband and whispered, "Darius, I'm scared." Darius looked into his wife's terrified eyes and felt his heart breaking. This was supposed to be their family vacation, their chance to relax and make happy memories together. Instead, his wife was trembling with fear. His daughter was crying hysterically, and they were about to be treated like criminals by people who were supposed to protect and serve. "Stay calm, baby," he whispered back to Keisha. "Let me handle this. Everything's going to be okay." Keisha nodded, but she was holding Amara even tighter now, trying desperately not to show just how terrified she really was. She had seen too many news stories, had heard too many accounts from friends and family members, to believe that being innocent was always enough to keep you safe. And somewhere in the distance, they could already hear the sound of sirens getting closer. Before we continue with what happened when those police officers arrived, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. This story is about to take a turn that will absolutely shock you. And you don't want to miss the moment when the tables turn in the most spectacular way possible. Here's a question I want you to think about. Have you ever witnessed someone being harassed or discriminated against in public? Did you speak up, or did you stay silent? Let me know in the comments, because what happened next shows exactly why bystanders can make all the difference in these situations. What none of these people knew, not Brielle, not the supportive crowd, not even the 911 dispatcher, was that they had just set in motion a chain of events that would expose the truth in ways that nobody could have predicted. And the person they thought was a criminal was about to reveal an identity that would shock everyone involved and change multiple lives forever. The sound of sirens grew louder and more ominous as two police cruisers came speeding toward the beach, their red and blue lights flashing like a warning of the chaos that was about to unfold. What happened next would expose the ugly reality of how racial bias could turn law enforcement officers into the very criminals they were supposed to catch. The first officer out of the lead vehicle was a man in his 40s named Murphy. And you could tell just by looking at him that this was someone who had been wearing a badge for way too long without anyone ever questioning his methods. Murphy was a 15-year veteran of the police force, and his personnel file was thick with citizen complaints that had somehow never resulted in any serious consequences. Behind him came his partner, a younger officer in his 30s named Stevens, who had learned early in his career that the safest thing to do was follow Murphy's lead and ask questions later. Stevens wasn't necessarily a bad person, but he was weak, and in law enforcement, weakness could be just as dangerous as outright malice. The moment these officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands went straight to their weapons. Not their radios, not their notebooks, not their de-escalation training, their guns. Because in their minds, they weren't responding to a family dispute or a property access question. They were responding to what they believed was a dangerous criminal situation involving potential human trafficking. Murphy took one look at this scene. A black man standing protectively near his wife and daughter, all of them clearly distressed by the confrontation with Brielle, and immediately made assumptions that would have been laughable if they hadn't been so terrifying. "Step away from the child, now," Murphy barked, his voice carrying the kind of aggressive authority that was designed to intimidate rather than protect. The command hit the Blackwell family like a physical blow. Here was a police officer, someone who was supposed to serve and protect, immediately treating Darius like a predator and his own daughter like a victim who needed to be rescued from him. Darius, drawing on 20 years of experience in dealing with hostile situations, kept his voice calm and professional as he tried to explain what was really happening. "Officer, there seems to be a misunderstanding here," he said, reaching slowly for his identification documents. "We're guests at the vacation rental property, and we have all the proper documentation to prove our right to be here." But Murphy wasn't interested in hearing explanations or looking at documentation. In his mind, he had already decided what was happening, and nothing was going to change his predetermined conclusion. "These could be fake," Murphy said dismissively, barely glancing at the rental agreements, identification cards, and credit card receipts that clearly prove the family's legitimacy. Anyone can print fake papers these days. That's when Murphy gestured to his partner Stevens, and what happened next would traumatize this family in ways that would last for years. Stevens moved in and began searching Darius roughly, his hands aggressive and invasive as he patted down a man who had done absolutely nothing wrong. The search was completely unnecessary, totally unprofessional, and designed more to humiliate than to ensure officer safety. Keisha watched this degrading spectacle in absolute terror, her worst nightmares playing out in front of her eyes as she saw her husband being treated like a common criminal by people who were supposed to protect them. Murphy then turned his attention to Keisha, and his questions revealed just how deep his racial assumptions ran. "Ma'am, is this man threatening you?" Murphy asked, as if it was impossible for a black man and black woman to simply be married and on vacation together. Keisha was so terrified by this point that she could barely speak. Her voice was barely audible as she whispered, "And no, officer, he's my husband." But Murphy wasn't satisfied with that answer. He looked at Keisha's obvious fear and completely misinterpreted what was causing it. "Are you sure?" he pressed. "You look scared. If this man is forcing you to say that, you can tell me the truth." The irony was devastating. Keisha was indeed scared, but not of her loving husband who had never raised a hand to her in 18 years of marriage. She was scared of the police officers who were treating her family like criminals based on nothing more than the color of their skin. I'm just nervous around police," Keisha managed to whisper. And those words contained a lifetime of experiences that Murphy would never understand or even try to comprehend. Then Murphy turned his attention to little Amara, and what he said next showed just how completely he had bought into Brielle's ridiculous trafficking narrative. "Are you okay, sweetie?" he asked the 8-year-old girl who was crying and clinging to her mother. "Are these people hurting you?" The question was so absurd, so completely divorced from reality, that it would have been funny if it hadn't been so tragic. Here was a child who was obviously distressed because police officers were treating her father like a criminal, and Murphy was interpreting her tears as evidence that she was being victimized by her own parents. Darius, realizing that this situation was spiraling completely out of control, decided to reveal just enough about his identity to hopefully bring some sanity to the proceedings. "Officers," he said, his voice still calm despite the outrageous treatment he was receiving. "I'm law enforcement myself. We can handle this professionally and clear up any misunderstanding." But Murphy's response revealed the depth of his prejudice and his complete inability to imagine that a black man could hold a position of authority in law enforcement. Murphy actually laughed, a cold, mocking sound that cut through the air like a knife. "Sure you are," he said with obvious disbelief. "That's what they all say. Next you'll be telling me you're the FBI director or something." The irony of that statement would soon become apparent to everyone present, but in that moment, Murphy was just displaying the kind of casual racism that assumed no black man could possibly hold a legitimate position of authority. Despite having been shown valid documentation, despite the family's obvious legitimacy, Despite the complete absence of any actual evidence of wrongdoing, Murphy made a decision that would end his career and expose him to federal prosecution. "You're under arrest," he announced, pulling out his handcuffs with the kind of satisfaction that suggested he enjoyed this part of his job way too much. "Trespassing, child endangerment, and suspicious activity," he rattled off, as if these charges had any basis in reality whatsoever. The moment Keisha saw those handcuffs, she completely broke down. All of her fears, all of her nightmares about what could happen to her family, were coming true right in front of her eyes. "Please don't hurt him. Please," she sobbed, her voice breaking with desperation and terror. But Murphy was unmoved by her pleas. "Ma'am, step back," he ordered, as if her natural desire to protect her husband was somehow interfering with justice. Meanwhile, Brielle was practically dancing with joy at this vindication of her racist assumptions. "I knew it. I knew it," she shouted to anyone who would listen. "Lock him up. I told you they were criminals." Her celebration of this injustice was disgusting to witness, but it also revealed the true nature of her motivations. This had never been about property access or neighborhood security. This had always been about her belief that people who looked like the Blackwell family didn't deserve to enjoy the same privileges as people who looked like her. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Darius's wrists, little Amara became absolutely hysterical. She had never seen anything like this before, had never imagined that police officers could be the bad guys, and couldn't understand why they were hurting her daddy, who had never done anything wrong in his entire life. The sight of this 8-year-old girl screaming in terror as her father was arrested should have been enough to make any decent human being question what was happening. But Murphy and Stevens were too committed to their narrative to let reality interfere with their predetermined conclusions. But the nightmare was just beginning. Murphy, apparently not satisfied with arresting an innocent man in front of his terrified family, decided to make the situation even worse. "We need to call child services," he announced, as if Amara was some kind of abandoned or endangered child rather than a little girl on vacation with her loving parents. When Keisha heard those words, something primal and desperate took over. The idea that they might take her daughter away, that this racist encounter might result in her family being completely torn apart, was more than she could bear. "Don't take my baby, please," she sobbed, holding Amara tighter, as if her physical grip could somehow protect them from the insanity that was unfolding around them. Stevens, who had been following Murphy's lead throughout this entire encounter, was finally beginning to show some signs of discomfort with how far this had gone. You could see it in his face, a growing awareness that maybe, just maybe, they had gotten this situation completely wrong. But Stevens was too weak and too afraid of confronting his senior partner to actually speak up or do anything to stop the injustice that was happening right in front of him. So he just stood there, looking uncomfortable, but doing nothing to help this innocent family. Meanwhile, the crowd of beachgoers had grown larger, and many of them were now filming everything on their phones. Some of them were beginning to protest what they were seeing, realizing that this aggressive police response seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. "This is crazy," one woman shouted. "They're just a family on vacation." "Why are you arresting him?" called out another bystander. "What did he actually do wrong?" But their protests fell on deaf ears. Murphy was too invested in his narrative, too committed to his assumptions, and too arrogant to admit that he might have made a mistake. What none of these officers realized was that their racist assumptions and their complete failure to do basic police work had just created a federal incident that would make national news, end careers, and expose the kind of systemic bias that turned innocent families into victims. The backup that Darius had texted for was on the way, and when those federal agents arrived, the tables were about to turn in the most spectacular way imaginable. Murphy and Stevens had no idea that they had just arrested the person who was essentially their boss's boss. and the revelation that was coming would shock everyone present and change multiple lives forever. But in that moment, all anyone could see was an innocent family being destroyed by racism, prejudice, and the kind of police misconduct that had become all too common in America. The question wasn't whether justice would eventually be served. It was whether this family would ever recover from the trauma they were experiencing right now. If you were in Darius's shoes, would you have immediately reveal who you are, or wait for the backup to come before you reveal your identity? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Just when it seemed like this family's nightmare couldn't get any worse, when Keisha was holding her sobbing daughter and watching her husband being treated like a criminal, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the chaos like thunder rolling across the beach. But these weren't more police cars coming to make the situation worse. These were 3 black SUVs with tinted windows and federal government plates, moving with the kind of purpose and authority that made everyone stop what they were doing and pay attention. The vehicles came to a coordinated stop, and what happened next looked like something out of a movie. 6 FBI agents in crisp black suits emerged simultaneously, moving with the precision and confidence that came from years of federal law enforcement training. These weren't local cops playing dress-up. These were the real deal, and everyone present could feel the shift in power dynamics immediately. Leading this federal response team was Agent Thornwood, a seasoned FBI veteran who had worked with Darius for over a decade and knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with when he got that emergency text message. Keisha looked up through her tears and saw these federal agents approaching. For a moment, confusion replaced her fear as she whispered, "Darius?" She didn't understand what was happening, but something about the way these agents carried themselves gave her the first glimmer of hope she had felt since this nightmare began. Murphy, who had been so confident and aggressive just moments before, looked at this federal presence and felt his first twinge of uncertainty. But his arrogance was still intact, and his response revealed just how little he understood about the situation he had created. "Great, more complications," he muttered, as if the arrival of federal agents was somehow an inconvenience, rather than a sign that he had made a catastrophic mistake. Stevens, however, was sharp enough to notice the federal badges and credentials that these agents were carrying, and a cold dread began to settle in his stomach. Unlike his partner, Stevens was beginning to realize that they might have stumbled into something much bigger than they had anticipated. Agent Thornwood approached Murphy with the kind of calm authority that came from someone who outranked everyone present by several levels. His voice was steady, professional, and carried the weight of federal law enforcement behind it. "Release that man immediately," Thornwood commanded, and there was no question in his tone that this was an order, not a request. But Murphy, still clinging to his delusions of authority and his racist assumptions, made the mistake that would end his career once and for all. "This is local jurisdiction, Fed boy," he sneered, using a dismissive tone that showed just how little respect he had for federal authority when it interfered with his prejudices. The phrase "Fed boy" hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone present realized that they were about to witness something extraordinary. That's when Darius, still standing in handcuffs but with his dignity intact, looked directly at Murphy and delivered the words that would change everything. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "I'm FBI Chief Darius Blackwell, Counterterrorism Division." As he spoke these words, Agent Thornwood stepped forward and displayed Darius's federal credentials for everyone to see. Credentials that proved beyond any doubt that the man Murphy had arrested was not just an FBI agent, but the head of one of the most important divisions in federal law enforcement. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. You could hear the waves crashing on the beach. You could hear the distant sound of traffic, but not a single person in that crowd made a sound, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Keisha stopped crying and stared in shock at the federal agents who were now surrounding her family. She watched in amazement as the entire dynamic of the situation shifted in a matter of seconds. As the people who had been treating her husband like a criminal suddenly realized they had made the biggest mistake of their professional lives. Murphy's face went completely white as the blood drained from his features. You could actually watch the moment when he realized that his career in law enforcement was over, that he had just arrested the head of the FBI counterterrorism division based on nothing more than racial prejudice and his own twisted assumptions. Agent Thornwood's next words drove the point home with devastating clarity. "You just arrested the head of the FBI counterterrorism division," he announced to the crowd, making sure that everyone present understood the magnitude of what had occurred. Stevens, who had been uncomfortable throughout this entire encounter, immediately moved to uncuff Darius, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys while apologizing profusely. "Sir, I'm so sorry, sir." Stevens kept repeating, as if saying it enough times could somehow undo the damage that had been done. "We had no idea, sir. We were just responding to a call." But his apologies rang hollow because the truth was that they should have known. They should have done their jobs properly, should have investigated the situation thoroughly, and should never have let their racial biases cloud their judgment. Keisha watched this transformation in amazement, seeing how quickly the officers' attitudes changed once they realized who her husband really was. The same men who had been treating her family like criminals were now bowing and scraping and desperately trying to cover their tracks. Brielle, who had been so confident in her accusations, so certain that she had caught dangerous criminals, was now faced with a reality that completely destroyed her narrative. "That's impossible," she shouted, her voice shrill with desperation. "He's lying. That badge has to be fake. People like him don't become FBI chiefs." But her protests only made her look more foolish and more racist with each word she spoke. The federal credentials were real, the agents surrounding Darius were real, and her entire worldview was crumbling before her eyes. The crowd that had gathered was now gasping and murmuring as they realized what they had just witnessed. Phones were recording everything, capturing the moment when racial profiling collided with federal authority in the most spectacular way possible. Little Amara, who had been crying hysterically as she watched her father being arrested, looked up at all the agents in suits and asked with innocent confusion, "Daddy, are all these people here to help us?" It was such a pure, innocent question from a child who was trying to make sense of a world where police officers could be the bad guys and federal agents could be the good guys. Where her father could go from being treated like a criminal to being revealed as one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. The first thing Darius did once he was freed from those handcuffs was comfort his shaking wife and traumatized daughter. His family came first, always. Regardless of his professional responsibilities or the political implications of what had just happened. "I was so scared, Darius," Keisha whispered as she collapsed into her husband's arms, finally able to breathe for the first time since this nightmare had begun. "I know, baby," he whispered back, holding both his wife and daughter close. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. I'm so sorry." But once he had comforted his family, Darius turned his attention to the officers who had just provided him with a perfect real-world example of exactly the kind of behavior he spent his professional life investigating and prosecuting. "Officers," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority and his disappointment, "you just demonstrated exactly why I investigate civil rights violations for a living." Those words hit Murphy and Stevens like physical blows, because they realized that this wasn't just about a single incident of bad policing. This was about a pattern of behavior that was now going to be scrutinized at the federal level. But the revelations weren't over yet. Agent Thornwood had more information to share that would turn this situation completely upside down. Furthermore, Thornwood announced to the stunned crowd, I need to inform everyone present that Ms. Brielle Ashworth has been under federal surveillance as part of an ongoing investigation. The gasps from the crowd were audible as people realized that the woman who had started this entire confrontation was herself a subject of federal investigation. Her vacation rental properties have been linked to a money laundering operation, Thornwood continued, and her pattern of discriminatory behavior toward minority renters has been documented as part of our civil rights investigation. Brielle's face went from red with anger to pale with terror as she realized that while she had been focused on harassing this innocent family, federal agents had been building a case against her for months. Additionally, Thornwood said, looking directly at Murphy, Officer Murphy's history of racial profiling and citizen complaints is now evidence in multiple federal civil rights cases. Murphy realized in that moment that this incident wasn't just going to end his career. It was going to result in federal prosecution that could send him to prison for violating the civil rights of American citizens under color of law. The tables had turned so completely, so dramatically, that everyone present was struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The family that had been treated like criminals were revealed to be among the most respected members of American law enforcement. The woman who had accused them of being criminals was herself under federal investigation, and the officers who had arrested them were now facing the end of their careers and potential federal prosecution. What had started as a racist harassment of an innocent family on vacation had become a federal incident that would make national news, change multiple lives forever, and provide a perfect example of how justice could prevail when the truth finally came to light. But this was just the beginning of the consequences that would flow from this moment. And the final resolution of this incredible story would restore your faith in the possibility that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys really do win in the end. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within minutes, Murphy was suspended pending federal investigation, his badge and weapon confiscated, his career over. Stevens immediately began cooperating with federal investigators, revealing Murphy's long pattern of racial profiling and aggressive behavior toward minority citizens. Brielle found herself in handcuffs, arrested for civil rights violations and fraud. The woman who had accused this family of being criminals was now facing federal charges herself. Child Services arrived and apologized profusely for being weaponized in this racist attack. Department heads from multiple agencies rushed to personally apologize to FBI Chief Darius Blackwell for the unconscionable treatment his family had endured. But while justice moved quickly on an institutional level, the Blackwell family was still processing their trauma. Keisha was still shaking uncontrollably. "I thought they were going to hurt you," she whispered to Darius, her voice breaking. "I thought they were going to take you away from us." "I'm sorry you had to go through that, baby," Darius replied, holding his wife close. "I'm sorry our daughter had to see that." Little Amara looked up at her mother with innocent confusion. "Mommy, why were you so scared?" It was a heartbreaking question from a child who had just lost a piece of her innocence. "I've never been so terrified in my life," Keisha finally said. And those words carried the weight of every mother's worst nightmare. As the truth emerged, the scope of what had happened became even more shocking. Darius revealed that this incident wasn't completely random. His family's vacation had coincided with an ongoing federal investigation into vacation rental discrimination, targeting minority families across multiple states. Brielle Ashworth's properties were part of a larger pattern of civil rights violations we've been documenting for months, he explained. Murphy's arrest history showed clear racial bias stretching back years. Federal prosecutors began building landmark civil rights cases that would send shockwaves through law enforcement. The community response was overwhelming. Legitimate neighbors apologized profusely, local businesses offered free services, and the tourism board panicked about reputation damage. Other minority families came forward sharing similar experiences, revealing this was just the tip of the iceberg. National news picked up the story of how an FBI chief's family vacation became a federal civil rights case, sparking nationwide conversations about racial profiling and discrimination. With federal protection surrounding them, Amara finally got her dream beach day. The community rallied around the family, volunteers organized activities, and local scientists helped with her projects. Keisha slowly began to relax with security present, and the family's bonds grew stronger through surviving this crisis together. The broader impact was transformative. Murphy was fired and faced federal charges. The police department went under federal oversight. Brielle's rental empire collapsed overnight. New policies were implemented to protect minority vacationers nationwide. As cameras rolled, the family shared their message with the world. My wife was terrified. My daughter was traumatized. This should never happen to any family, Darius said, directly to the camera. Keisha added, I was scared for our lives. No family should endure this terror on vacation. Little Amara summed it up perfectly. The bad people went away, and the good people helped us. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button now. Share your experiences with discrimination in the comments, and let's continue fighting for justice and equality. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. Murphy was serving time in federal prison for civil rights violations. Brielle was banned from real estate for life, doing court-ordered community service. Seaside Heights became a model for inclusive tourism. Keisha had become a powerful advocate for police reform after getting therapy for her trauma. Most remarkably, the Blackwell family returned to the same beach the following year, welcomed by a community that had learned from its mistakes. What began as a racist attack on an innocent family became a catalyst for nationwide change, proving that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest victories for justice. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.